Welcome to the Crazy Wisdom Podcast. My guest today is Ried Blackman. He is an ethicist and an ethics consultant, and also a former philosophy professor. And he focuses on the intersection between ethics, business, and technology. So welcome to the show, Ried.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
The biggest thing for myself is to understand what the difference is between ethics and morals. What is that? Or what do you think that is?
Yeah, so look, I mean, one thing you could just do is use the terms interchangeably, right? So you can just say, look, ethics, morality, it all has broadly to do with something like what you ought to do, how to live well, yada, yada. So let's just call that ethics, call it morality. It's all the same. That's one option. That's sort of the one that I tend to lean towards. That said, there's also a fairly common usage in at least academic philosophy where morality is a slightly narrower scope than ethics. So you think about morality, think about ethics. Let's start with ethics. Think about ethics more broadly as how ought you to live, what constitutes a good life, what should structure our relationships with other people, yada, yada. And then you can think of morality as a subset of ethics. So morality concerns roughly the kinds of obligations that we have towards other people, like what we owe to others. So while there's lots of questions about, what makes my life go well or what makes a human life go well, you can construe that if you like as an ethical question, but not strictly a moral question, where a moral question might be something more like, what kinds of obligations do I have to fellow citizens or to citizens of countries not my own who are not well off? What are my obligations towards them? You might conceive of that as specifically a moral question. But, at the end of the day, it's not so important how you define these things, so long as you're clear about how you're using your terms.
Seems really similar to the yamas and the niyamas in Ashtanga yoga philosophy. There's 8 limbs of yoga, and then the first 2 are yama and niyama. I don't remember the orders, but it's essentially, and what you just said makes me think that it's ethics and morals. It's basically, and I'm forgetting what exactly the yamas and niyamas are exactly, but it's really interesting to bring. Have you studied any Eastern philosophy?
I have not. No, the closest I've come is to writing a lot on role ethics. So what are the kinds of obligations or reasons we have to act given the social roles we occupy, which is sort of, those are the kinds of questions that are discussed and answered in Confucianism. But that's my closest connection to Eastern philosophy.
And then, so what wrapped you in so intimately with Western philosophy? How did you get involved in it?
I mean, there's a question about one way of understanding that question is how do you get into philosophy, and the other is how and why Western philosophy. The answer to the Western philosophy one is easy, because once I was interested in philosophy, the Western philosophy is what was available to me. Right? I was in a university in, upstate New York. I don't think they had anyone doing any Eastern philosophy, so the thing that came up was Western philosophy. So that's why Western. Why philosophy? Just because I had some questions and I wanted some answers. I was insanely curious, not just curious, but sort of obsessed with figuring out whether ethics or morality is bullshit. Because I entered college with a certain set of ethical or moral beliefs, choose whatever term you like, both, but what constitutes a good life, yada, yada. And then I took a philosophy course that started to push on questions about the foundations of those claims. Why should you believe those claims? What's the justification? What makes you think that they're true? What's the evidence for those claims? And once I read some of that stuff, especially stuff by David Hume, I was like, oh shit, I don't know. I have no idea. And so it seemed like, oh shit, is morality and ethics just about mere preferences? Like, I prefer not to be murdered, but it wouldn't be wrong to do it. And, I prefer you don't murder, but, you prefer to do it. So are we just like on a par here because I have my preferences, you have yours, and they're sort of both equally respectable? And I thought that there's no way that's right. I mean, the Holocaust is bad. It feels pretty obvious. On the other hand, I didn't know how to justify that claim, how it was anything more than an assertion of a preference or a set of desires of mine. And so when my ethical commitments came up against a healthy skepticism, I didn't know what the hell to do except to keep digging deeper. And that's why philosophy.
Very interesting. So I got a few different questions from that. The biggest one, I guess, is for myself is like, what is the point of studying something that everyone else has already studied? like within the just explosion of information and knowledge and maybe even wisdom over the last 200 years with the Enlightenment, there's just an explosion, and it's you can't have an expert know one entire field, and so you have to become more and more and more and more and more specialized. But then it seems like in this philosophy thing where you're talking about this meta stuff that is like overarching everything else and then maybe even transcending it, but it seems to be interdisciplinary in nature. And so like, why do you do it? Or like, what is the importance of studying something that's already been studying? I know you mentioned that you teach, and teaching is an important part for you to learn. Like, and I guess there's something to be said about teaching other people because they don't know it yet. They're not familiar with it yet.
Right.
Yeah. What do you think?
I mean, there's a bunch of things to say here. So look, I remember when I was I was a sophomore in college, and I was in a philosophy class, and the professor, this woman, Maud Marie Clark, was teaching a Nietzsche seminar on the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. And she was talking, and I just thought, oh God, I just want to know the things the way that she knows them. Like she's just so impressive. Like she has a grip on these things that I clearly lack. And I just want to understand it. So, the motivation wasn't something like, can I do something that no one else has done before? In fact, sort of quite the contrary. It was, can I understand what the hell people are talking about when they talk about these issues that are really important to me? And so, why study this thing that other people have studied for so long? Well, because they understand something I don't understand, and I really want to understand it. My motivation wasn't necessarily to sort of like discover something new. And it wasn't to have a big impact. Everyone loves talking about impact now. I'm sort of turned off by the whole thing. It was just to understand like what was true and what was false and what was bullshit. When were my ethical commitments well grounded, or ought they to be well grounded? Or I mean, can they be well grounded, or do they need to be jettisoned? And I just needed to understand that stuff, because at the time anyway, it seemed to me utterly important that I not, if you like, move forward without understanding whether the foundations were solid.
It's so interesting. That brings up another question I don't want to get into yet, but I'm just going to make a note. What is David Hume's main message, and like what draws you to him in particular?
I mean, David Hume doesn't have a message. He was a phenomenally prolific philosopher. Just wrote a tremendous amount. He was brilliant. The thing that drew me to David Hume was, though, in my early days, I'm talking, freshman in college, although the concern lasts until today, there's one very, very famous passage where he says something like this. I'm paraphrasing, but he says something like, look, I'm often reading these moral philosophers, and they tell me that something is the case, or they tell me something is not the case. And I'm reading along, and they're saying this is the case, this is not the case. And then all of a sudden, I'm surprised to find that they've subtly transitioned to talking about what ought to be the case, or what ought not to be the case. And I don't know how they made that transition, because the ought doesn't follow from the is. There are a bunch of poor people out there, therefore you ought to help them. That doesn't follow. There are a bunch of poor people out there, so you ought to let them go, right? Neither one of those oughts followed. So something else has to get in there. What's the something else? It looks like you can. So what David Hume was saying was something like you can if you like pile up all the facts about the world, and you won't get to any oughts. You won't get to any ethical facts, any moral facts. Where do they come from then? David Hume said, roughly, it comes from our sentiments, or the way that most philosophers talk about it now, it comes from our desires. But then it just seems, to put it in sort of contemporary parlance, really subjective. Oh, okay, so here's all the facts. You do this, you can, it's a fact that they rounded up these 6 million people and then they killed them, blah, blah, blah. You get all the facts. And now how do you get to they ought not to have done that? Is it just preference? Like I desire that people not do that sort of thing? And they say, oh, but we do desire to do it. And I say, yeah, but I'm right. But how can I say I'm right if my saying you ought not to do that is just an expression of my desire. I don't seem to be correct in a way that they are incorrect. And that's what I wanted out of ethics. I wanted it to be, factual in the sense that you could just be wrong, which is to say, not just morally wrong, but you can be factually incorrect about your ethical conclusions or your moral beliefs.
Mm.
And David Hume makes it very hard to see how you can get there.
Interesting. Has there been anybody after David Hume who has even come close to contradicting that or bringing some sort of nuance back into that from what David Hume said?
Yeah, a tremendous amount. I mean, so there's this guy, G.E. Moore, philosopher, I think he was at Oxford, maybe Cambridge, probably Oxford. In 1903, he wrote this book, Principia Ethica. You take Hume, you turn him on his head, and you have G.E. Moore. It's like everything that Hume said is wrong. There's facts to the matter about what's right and wrong and good and bad. And specifically, he thought they were what he called non-natural. Like goodness is a non-natural property. It's not the kind of property that, say, is investigable by the empirical sciences.
Mm.
Anyway, so Moore wrote that in 1903, and that was in some way sort of the real birth of what's called the metaethics. So metaethics is the sort of sustained, focused analysis or investigation as to whether ethics and morality is objective or subjective or something along those lines. And so you've had dozens, hundreds of philosophers writing on this since G.E. Moore. And there are Humeans in the mix, that is to say, people who are deeply inspired by David Hume. There are Moreians in the mix, that is to say, people who are at least inspired by Moore. And then there are other kinds of people who hold different kinds of views about ethics and morality that are not Hume's. They're not Hume-like and they're not Moore-like. So that said, these kinds of debates have been going on since literally the beginning of philosophy. But it gets the kind of focus that I'm talking about right now, starting in about 1903.
Interesting. A question comes to mind about like the perennial wisdom that Aldous Huxley talked about, and I forget what the opposite of that is. There's perennial wisdom, and I guess there's just localized temporal wisdom that's like wisdom that's helpful for today, and then there's wisdom that's always true, always useful. And a thing that always confuses me is, why does some knowledge get lost? For example, like why did from 400 BC to 800 AD, and I guess there was a religion form that within that time period that changed the way everything worked. But it did seem like there was a dark age where all this stuff was lost and then rediscovered. And it's like, why did that happen? Why is everything rediscovered? And then have we rediscovered the stuff that will just like, if I read some script found in, ancient Greece or something like that, that's been lost or that hasn't been translated yet or something like that. And I think that happens more with Sanskrit literature, but like, is there one piece of wisdom that'll just blow my mind if I read it, that will open up a doorway that will just totally change my life? Why does some knowledge get lost?
I mean, the short answer from my perspective, that is to say, speaking from my expertise, is that I don't know. I mean, that's sort of, I don't know, a sociological or an anthropological question about why do beliefs get transmitted or not. And I don't know. I don't study that. I mean, I have, various speculations to offer, but I mean, I thought that you already sort of alluded to so first of all, there's not a reason, right, why a belief or, some discovery doesn't get transmitted through the generations. There's lots of different reasons, I'm sure. All the books got burned up in the fire. The church locked him away in a prison and didn't let him, tell everyone his discoveries. Whatever. There's surely lots of reasons. There was some competing theory that looked more plausible at the time, so everyone bought the more plausible theory and forgot about the other theory because it seemed less plausible. But it turns out, upon further investigation, that the one that seemed less plausible actually is more plausible. Right? So there's going to be lots of different histories for why certain kinds of truths get forgotten or lost or downplayed or, don't spread the way we'd like them to. And especially once the other, here's another just like explanation. Once people fasten on to certain beliefs, especially if those beliefs are hooked up with people's conception of ethics, morality, blah, 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 they're very hard to let go. And so people tend not to believe those things that are in conflict with the way they live their lives. So if you have a certain set of beliefs and you live your life a certain way, and then it turns out that there's some truth out there that were you to come to believe, you would upend your life. You're sort of psychologically motivated to come to believe that true thing.
But there are some people who are psychologically motivated to just shatter their brain against reality sometimes. Like,
Sure.
and I wonder why. Well, and this seems to be the case with a lot of philosophers. And you talk about Nietzsche, because Nietzsche seemed like that. He seemed like he went off the deep end in order to find the truth. Like, is that accurate?
That he went off the deep end to
Yeah.
find the truth?
Yeah.
It's true that he sort of he totally left the what's the expression? He left the prairie or something. I don't know. Anyway, left the compound. He completely turned his back on what he had been raised to believe and adopted a wildly different set of beliefs. That's true. I don't think that was the result of his going off a cliff. At the end of his life, he did go insane, but from what I gather, that's because he contracted syphilis at some point. So I don't think it was sort of like, his drive to truth made him go insane. I don't think that happened.
Interesting.
And Nietzsche also is pretty skeptical about there being a drive to truth. That there are other psychological forces at play usually.
Well, and this gets into the question I've been wanting to ask for a while now: is the religion? Why is it so ingrained in us to find some sort of overarching narrative that will give us redemption or faith, and stick to that no matter what? And I mean, is that accurate that we stick to these things? Is faith a matter of belief? And it just seems like there's been a lot of talk currently about how religion doesn't go away. It just gets replaced by a new thing. And our current religion is secular religion. That's an argument that's made. What is that importance of religion and this religious drive to someone? Or like, what is it? And yeah.
So again, I'm going to say that I don't know. This strikes me as a psychological question. There's, although Nietzsche had a lot to say about this sort of thing, which is something like we weren't always like this. This kind of need is the result of Christianity's influence on us. Really, Judaism and Christianity. So he thinks that at some point we came to demand a reason for our suffering, and as opposed to like at least. His gloss on it is something like, in the olden days, think like Homeric times, the people who lived shitty lives were just like, yeah, we're just unlucky. This sucks. Like, I wish we were the nobles and strong and powerful and beautiful and wealthy. That'd be awesome. It's just not our lot in lives. We're like this. That sucks. And it ends there, so to speak. But then the Jewish priests and Christianity come along, so says Nietzsche, and says, look, there's a reason for your suffering. First, it's because the nobles are oppressing you, but ultimately it's because you've sinned before God, yada, yada. And so we've been sort of trained to demand a deeper explanation or justification for our suffering. And so Nietzsche thinks like that's been inculcated in us now. And religion is the cause of the void, and the proffered solution for the void, filler.
And that is really interesting, because there's another question that comes into my mind, and you might not be, you might say the same thing, that I don't know, but in the East, it does seem like they have that same drive, but I can't parse out whether that's because of colonization or because of it's something that was there beforehand, because colonization did have a huge effect on institutions and on the elite and all the people who kind of created policy and created all these institutions. So there's a force there as well. But it does seem like it's a global thing to find a religion. But I guess you could go back, maybe that's why like shamans are becoming so popular today, because it's this kind of like wide scale rejection. And now we're just going to focus on what existed before all of the agricultural communities and societies and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, so look, it's extremely difficult to figure out what is, if you like, natural versus what's the result of culture, or what's, maybe put it slightly differently, what's non-cultural versus cultural. I doubt that we would ever be able to figure out the answer to that, especially because, I mean, our biological constitutions, our psychological constitutions evolved in cultures. So I just don't know that we're ever going to be able to tease this apart. I suspect it's not even a sensical question. This is very much off the cuff, but it strikes me as like not obviously a sensible or sensical question, because it presupposes that you could sort of tease apart what's purely biological about us and our psychologies versus what's culturally, I don't know.
So
I
no,
don't know.
it's an interesting, maybe even asking the question of nurture versus nature it's kind of like what Buddha would say about certain questions. It's just like, it doesn't matter. There's no way you're going to get an answer to that question. Why are you focusing your time? Why are you focusing your inquiry on it?
It's not quite that. It's not, look, we'll never know the answer, so screw it. It's more like, maybe we won't know the answer because we're not asking a question that it makes sense to ask. Like our concepts are tripping us up, or our conception of the situation is tripping us up, such that we're asking a question that doesn't really make any sense. I wish I could give you an example of that right now, but this sort of strikes me as one. The nature versus nurture question strikes me as sort of silly in a way. It's both. Like, nobody thinks the entirety of your life is governed by your nature. No one thinks the entirety of your life or your personality is governed by nurture. Everyone sensible thinks it's a mix. Is it 80-20? Is it 70-30? I mean, is there even a way of answering that question? Like, how are we gonna like segment up your life to figure out like what's a percentage of what? Yeah. So what's cultural and what's biological? I mean, obviously there are certain cultural influences on the way that we express certain biological needs, like sex, sleep. But those examples of biological desires are so few, and we have so many desires that are not obviously just about sex and sleep that, I don't know, I'm starting to ramble here, but I just think that I'm not sure there's much sense in the question about what's culture and what's biology. Anyway.
This gets into what I wanted to talk. Hopefully it gets into it. What is the importance of studying philosophy for doing better business? Is it possible to do better business by studying philosophy? And yeah, I guess that's the question.
Okay. So I have to shift gears now. Okay. So we're talking about philosophy and business. So that's interesting. I was actually talking to someone who's both a former student and a client of mine. And he was literally telling me this morning that he often gets asked the question, he has a successful startup, and people say to him, "Oh, man, you're killing it. Like, you must have studied like business as an undergrad." And he said, "No, man, I studied philosophy." And, that's obviously surprising to people. I think a lot of people think philosophy is about like smoking weed and thinking about how small we all are. And the reason that philosophy helps him, at least as he tells me, and I've told him the same thing, is that philosophy, at least as practiced in the Western Hemisphere, in, so-called like R1 research universities, like so good, the quote unquote best PhD granting programs in the States and Western Europe. You're breaking down arguments, and you're looking for evidence for claims, and you're calling bullshit on things, and you don't assent to the conclusion until you see the clear line of evidence or argumentation in support of it. And you know how to push at things. You know where things look weak, where arguments look weak. You know how to perhaps rebuild that argument, or when the argument is just no good. And what at least an entrepreneur does often is they're wearing a million different hats. They're trying to figure it all out. And if you've done some philosophy, what it helps you to do is sort through, first of all, just conceptually sort all those things out. Just figure out, keep everything, as it were, organized in your head. But then, people say, "Oh, we should market like this, or we should market like that, or we should sell like this, or we should develop this product or that product." A philosopher knows to say, "Well, why?" But that's not a good reason. But here are 4 reasons for thinking that's not that argument for what you're concluding is not strong, blah, 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 right? So there's just a level of intense scrutiny and analysis that comes with philosophy that transfers to just problem solving generally. And entrepreneurs are they spend most of their time solving problems.
Hmm. Is there any issue with that mode of thinking, dissecting everything into its component parts, and seeing whether there's evidence? Is there something that is not necessarily beneficial about doing that all the time? And what is the opposite to that? What is the opposite to dissecting something? Is it creating a holistic understanding?
Yeah, I mean, like anything taken to an extreme is not going to be very good. So I think that kind of analysis is great. At the same time, you also need to sort of be able to see the big picture and sort of have an insight about the big picture, or draw together disparate strands and see how they're actually connected in an important way. I mean, that's not analysis, that's synthesis or something like that. So I'm not, it's actually a really interesting question as to whether doing philosophy in the way that I've been trained to do it helps with that. I think the answer is probably yes. But yeah, someone once pointed out to me that one of the values that they see in studying the history of philosophy is that you're studying philosophers who have these massive systems. They're just system builders. Like every aspect of the philosophical realm is brought under a system. So their ethics, their metaphysics, their epistemology, sometimes their philosophy of language is all part of a big system, a coherent system, ideally coherent system. And when you study philosophy, what you learn is when you study these kinds of systems, what you learn is how to see all these different parts of a thing and how they tie together, the ways in which they're interwoven.
Interesting.
And so I suppose that there's a way in which, when you study the history of philosophy, one way of doing it is by grasping the systems of the so-called great philosophers and synthesizing their various ideas to see how they come under some, for instance, general principles that the philosopher upholds. That's contrasted with a lot of contemporary philosophy, which is the kind of hardcore analysis of argumentation that I was talking about earlier.
How can you tell when someone's argument is not coherent?
So usually arguments are coherent. I mean, it depends what you mean by coherent. If you mean by something like it makes some sense, they're usually they usually make some sense. But here's a standard thing to do if you're a philosopher of my background. You more or less break the argument down into premises and a conclusion, and then you do two kinds of things. Number one, you see whether the conclusion follows from the premises. You're gonna be like, yeah, you're right that A, B, and C, but it doesn't follow from that D. A, B, and C, sure, but for all you said, it could also follow that E or F or something like that. So that's a matter of whether the conclusion logically follows from the premises. The second thing you do is you just go premise by premise and ask whether it's true or false, and give arguments for thinking that it's true or false. So, okay, you said A, B, C, therefore D. I actually agree with you that D logically follows from A, B, and C. And I agree with you that A and C are true, but I think B is false. Here's the reasons I think it's false, blah, blah, blah. And so how do you tell whether an argument is coherent, or, to put it in the language of a philosopher, whether an argument is sound? You start doing the investigation.
Is that the Socratic method? If not, what is the Socratic method?
I think the Socratic method is different than that. The Socratic method is usually something like continuing to ask a person question, getting them to give a deeper or better answer. That's Socratic questioning.
Interesting.
So that's usually directed at a person.
Yeah, as opposed to an argument. Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'll offer a few questions I got here.
Yeah, whatever you want.
So how do you quickly download the synthesis of a great thinker?
I mean, the quicker you go, the more inaccurate it's going to be, all else equal. there are some really good philosophers out there who do some amazing work in the history of philosophy, explaining to us what the great thinkers thought. So the best way to do it is not to actually, if you want to sort of get an understanding of the system, like you read an introduction to a book about that philosopher by another philosopher. That's probably the easiest way. Right. So like if someone wanted to know a bunch about Hume, go to one of the Hume scholars and read the intro to their book, for instance.
And this gets into something I personally have difficulty with, and I've had difficulty with for a long time. You kind of pointed to your own experience when you were talking about the professor who you wanted to understand how she thought the way she did. But when I was younger, I would try reading these books. I tried reading the Communist Manifesto when I was 13, and it was just totally couldn't pronounce bourgeoisie or couldn't pronounce proletariat, and it was just like so aggravating. Why can't you understand some things at some times, but then you can later understand them? I mean, obviously the answer comes up to me when I'm asked that question, but like, what is the point of that blockage or the dissatisfaction or the friction?
I mean, look, there's probably lots of explanations, but sometimes the short of it is that this shit can be really complicated, man. Like it's just so complicated that there are a ton of new concepts, and the concepts relate to each other in various ways. And there can be many argumentative moves that are being made, and it's just a lot. I mean, it takes time to digest these things. It's one thing to sort of, it's one thing to learn the definition of a new word. It's another thing to actually be able to use the word in a sentence. And it's one thing to be able to use the word in a sentence when you're asked to use the word in a sentence. And it's another thing to actually be using that word on a semi-regular basis in your daily life, right? It just sort of takes time to digest and sort of coalesce with the background knowledge that you already have.
Interesting.
And when you're reading philosophy, it's not a single word and it's not a definition. It's oftentimes a bunch of concepts, and those concepts can often be new. And it's usually not one concept. Sometimes it's contrastive. So it's X or Y's. You'll learn like here's one concept and then here's the opposite of that. So there's conceiving of moral properties as non-natural and as natural. And now we got to, okay, shit. So what is it to be a natural property? And is a non-natural just the opposite of that? And okay, so you have to get the concepts down, and then you have to have some facility at using those concepts, which takes time. And then the argumentative moves can be many, and you can lose track of them. You can not understand the move, and though you haven't understood it, you're already on to the next paragraph where another move is being made. And so, you just got to slow down and read it again and again. I mean, there are times when I've read something and I've had, like zero clue what the hell I just read. Zero. Like I've read it and like, okay, I read words, just no idea what I'm supposed to get from them. But I'll read through, say, the whole chapter or the whole article or whatever. And then I'll go back and read it a second time and something magical happens where suddenly light bulbs start going off. And I think it's just because through that first time I was still getting acclimated. I'm still learning the concepts and learning sort of like what's this person up to and why are they saying this? And then once you get more of an understanding of all that stuff, you can read it again and understand more, and then read it a third time and then a fourth time.
That's really interesting, particularly about, I just got the idea for either a business or however I want to start incorporating that into my life of like, if I read something challenging, I can then, and I just can't get it, read it a couple of times, can't understand what's going on. And then I can, in my own personal life, then I would find a Facebook group or find somebody who knows about that topic and then ask them. And that's what I'm thinking about starting to do. But I wonder if there's also a business opportunity there too of creating, like breaking down all the deep philosophical works and then breaking them into segments and then getting the crowdsourced interpretation of them. I guess that I already do that with the Bible and all these other things as well.
Yeah.
It's an interesting idea.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the nice things about being at a university. You can just go ask your professor, what's going on here? I mean, a decent philosopher will be able to tell you, all right, so look, here's what's going on here. And then a good student can say, I still don't see why do you think that? Because the philosopher also says this thing, and that doesn't seem compatible with your interpretation of what he's saying over there. Then blah, blah, blah. And then you might be wrong and the professor might be right, but you'll have understood more about how those two parts connect in a way that you didn't before.
And that gets into the importance of, like, what is the importance of being wrong? Or if you don't want to answer that question, what is the role of technology in the growth of this abstraction that we were talking about, of these conceptual things, like we're still talking about essentially too?
Well, so, sorry, what was the first one? What the importance of being wrong?
Yeah, what is the importance of being wrong in terms of understanding reality, or I guess understanding reality, yeah.
I mean, I'd put it slightly differently. It's not important that you be wrong. It's important that you understand that you might very well be wrong. I mean, I think that it's really important to be intellectually humble. That was a lesson it took me quite a while to learn. I was a relatively advanced undergraduate, and I thought I was super smart. And then I transferred from a liberal arts college to a really good, like an Ivy League school, and I took a graduate level course, and I very quickly realized I didn't know what the hell I was talking about. And just knowing how much you don't know puts you in a really good position to learn stuff. Now, it could have been the case that I had all the right answers back then, but I didn't understand why they were the right answers. And so I still needed to understand that I may very well be wrong so that I could actually do the inquiry into the foundations of my beliefs, independently of whether or not those beliefs are true or false. So it's not important that you be wrong. It's important that you recognize that you may very well be wrong, and you'll have to do a bunch of work to figure out whether you are.
Interesting. Okay, so then for the last few minutes, what is the role of technology in this growth of this abstraction that we're talking about, and that we've been talking about, this essentially just like wild explosion of new concepts that we have to wrap our heads around, and then not only wrap our heads around and then use it in order to communicate to other people what's going on?
Yeah, it's not, I think it's confusing to people generally because a bunch of relatively new problems come up, say with artificial intelligence or augmented reality, and we have what appear to be novel ethical issues. The truth is, though, that for someone, I mean, I hate to say this because it sounds so arrogant, which is so contrary to what I just talked about. But I mean, for someone who has an expertise in ethics, it's not that confusing. Because if you have a strong foundation in the background of ethics, if you're just studying ethics and philosophy for a couple of decades, then these new problems are often new variations of older problems that we've been talking about for a long time. So I'll give you sort of a very general example. People are talking a lot about AI ethics now, and everyone's wringing their hands, and how do we think about this, blah, blah, blah. This is just so problematic. And it's sort of like, no, if you look at the history of medical ethics or bioethics, there's a lot of work there that transfers over, that gives us at the very least, if not the answers to questions that we confront when we talk about the ethical issues that say AI or AR or VR give rise to. It at least gives us the conceptual resources and the background to think about those things fruitfully. So for instance, there's a bunch of issues, people are ringing the alarm bells around invasions of privacy from all the data that companies are collecting. And they're using their AIs they're fueling their AI with that data, and then that AI is then inferring more data about us that we don't like, or that's private. And people are like, we have to start thinking about privacy. And so like, yeah, we've been thinking about privacy for a long time. like the healthcare community has thought about privacy a whole lot. You guys are talking about, how does technology impact our autonomy? We need to think about this. Then you have a bunch of engineers who are all worked up about autonomy, and they're sort of like, philosophers and ethicists have been talking about what constitutes autonomy for literally centuries. We've got lots to say on this. This is not a totally new problem for us. you want to talk about self-determination? Let's talk about self-determination. If you want to talk about, instead of bodily self-determination, when you're talking about people's rights to their bodies, you can talk about informational self-determination when you're talking about people's data, right? And then the kinds of arguments and the concepts that come to bear in thinking about what constitutes and justifies bodily self-determination can also come to bear on how we should conceive of and what justifies, if anything, a notion of the right to informational self-determination. So if you know ethics, then the things brought to us by new technologies are not nearly as baffling as a lot of people make them out to be.
Said that was going to be the last question, but it's not. So it gets into why do people ignore what has come before or not familiarize themselves with what has come before? And then there's also this moral panic or moral outrage or neuroticism that arises once people kind of oh, the world's going to end. And people have been saying that for a long time.
Yeah.
Maybe that doesn't mean they're not right, but
yeah.
What is the deal with all that?
I mean, there's a couple things to say. Number one, some people are just non-culpably ignorant of philosophy. They haven't taken a philosophy course. They took one, but it was on Plato, and that's not really relevant to this stuff. And so they just don't know that there's an entire field that's been dedicated to this. There's been intellectual inquiry around this for thousands of years, but they just don't know. Some people are they're not intellectually humble. They're arrogant, not necessarily in a sort of flagrant, obnoxious way, but in just sort of, I'm smart. I can figure it out myself. I have thoughts on this. And it's sort of great. You're really good at coding. You're super smart at math. You're a, brilliant physicist. You're a whatever, but you're not, that doesn't mean that you have the training and the background that you need in order to think about these things responsibly and well. You're going to wind up saying a bunch of things that a proper ethicist would say, no, you're just confused about a lot of things.
Interesting.
So I think there's an intellectual arrogance by people who are smart in a particular domain, thinking that they're not smart in a particular domain, they're just smart full stop. And so they don't need anyone's help.
Interesting. Okay. That's really cool. I feel like we could go on for hours, but thank you so much for coming on the show. And
My pleasure.
How can people find out more about you and what you're working on?
Oh, they can go to virtueconsultants.com. They can find me on LinkedIn. I sporadically tweet, but it's extremely sporadic because I'm not disciplined with it at all. But LinkedIn, my website, anyone wants to email me, Ried, R-E-I-D, @virtueconsultants.com. Happy to hear from you. We can talk business ethics. We can talk philosophy, whatever you like.
Very cool. Thank you so much.
No, my pleasure. Nice talking to you.